Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the nun vanished after midnight, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The nun's habit was empty. The bell tower rang out at precisely midnight, and 30 seconds later, Sister Magdalena's habit was found draped across the altar, perfectly folded, still warm, and completely empty. There were no signs of struggle, no broken glass, no disturbed candle wax, just the haunting scent of lavender and candle smoke still clinging to the cloth, as if she had simply melted into thin air. Father Brown stood at the back of the small chapel, his breath caught between disbelief and dread. The other nuns, pale as the marble saints carved above them, huddled in silence, whispering prayers too soft to be heard. It had been raining heavily earlier, yet the habit was bone dry, and no footsteps marked the muddy cloister path leading out. Sister Magdalena had been alone in the chapel for her midnight prayers, routine, devotional, harmless. And yet when Sister Agnes entered minutes later to check on her, there was no sign of life, just the empty garment, laid out like an offering. By morning, whispers had begun to rot the peace of the convent, that perhaps Magdalena had run, that she had sinned, that she had seen something, or worse, that something had seen her. Father Brown said nothing. He simply stood by the altar longer than anyone else, staring not at the habit, but at the small wooden crucifix above it, and the candle below, still burning steady, untouched. He asked the first question no one wanted to consider. Why would a woman vanish without her clothes, but leave behind nothing else? Not a shoe, not a rosary, not a note. The silence that followed his question was louder than any scream. When he asked to see Magdalena's cell, he was told gently that it had already been searched. "Then you won't mind if I look again," he said, eyes calm but sharp. Her room was spotless, too spotless, the bed made too tightly. A single book on the table, a worn Bible, with a dog-eared corner at Matthew 10:26. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. But Father Brown wasn't looking at the verse. He was looking at the pressure indentations in the pages underneath. Someone had written something on the pages above it, then torn the paper away. He rubbed the page lightly with a graphite pencil from his pocket. Slowly, the indentations came to life. A single sentence emerged. "Midnight is too late." Too late for what? The sisters begged him not to stir up fear. Magdalena was troubled, they insisted. She sometimes walked alone at night. She heard voices. She saw things. Father Brown nodded politely, but his eyes clouded. Delusion was too convenient a diagnosis. In the confessional, the air had grown colder. Not metaphorically, literally cold. He placed his palm on the small wooden grill that separated priest from penitent. It was wet. Not damp, wet. As though someone had breathed against it moments before, but the booth had been locked all night. Later that day, he asked Sister Agnes what Magdalena had been like the week prior. "Distracted," she said. "Quiet, more than usual." And she stopped singing. Father Brown paused. "Singing?" "Yes," said Sister Agnes. "Magdalena had a beautiful voice. She used to hum while scrubbing the floor, folding linens. Even while kneeling, he asked when the singing stopped. Agnes swallowed. The day after she found the letter. "What letter?" asked Father Brown. Agnes looked pale. "I wasn't supposed to know. She was crying in the library. I passed by and saw parchment on her lap. She hid it quickly. That night, she didn't come down for supper." Father Brown requested access to the library. At first, the Mother Superior refused. "There are old manuscripts there, delicate and private." But when he explained that the police were already on their way, she relented. The convent's library smelled of mildew, old wax, and secrets. Dust hung in the air like ash. Father Brown scanned the shelves. Nothing seemed out of place, except a prayer book missing from a tight row, with a gap just wide enough for a thin hand to slip something in. He reached behind the books, and his fingers touched paper. Not parchment, not modern paper either. Something in between. Faded, folded, and stained. The letter was written in Latin, in a hand that trembled. It was unsigned. But the message was clear enough. The sins of the past do not sleep. They breathe behind walls. They walk in silence. If she speaks, we all hang. The word "she" had been underlined in fresh ink. Father Brown folded the letter, tucked it into his coat, and said nothing. Not yet. That night, the storm returned. Thunder rolled like distant cannons. The nuns huddled in prayer, while the wind howled across the courtyard. At midnight, the bell rang once, just once, though no one had pulled the rope. They found muddy footprints on the stone floor of the cloister, bare feet, small, feminine, leading toward the chapel. But they stopped at the entrance, and there, just inside, someone had lit a single candle, though the door had been locked from the inside. Father Brown entered alone. The chapel was empty, but as he moved closer to the altar, he saw it, a smudge of ash near the habit's last resting place. A mark burned faintly into the stone. A symbol. It wasn't Christian. The symbol was circular, with 3 lines bisecting it vertically. One clean, one smudged, one fresh. He didn't recognize it, not fully, but something deep in his memory stirred. The next morning, Sister Agnes collapsed. She claimed she saw Magdalena in the corridor, pale, barefoot, dripping water. But when others rushed to see, there was no one, just the faint smell of lavender and the sound of distant humming. From that moment, panic took root. Doors were locked. Watches were posted. But Father Brown remained calm. He asked only one thing: to examine the bell tower. The stairs creaked like dying wood. The air grew colder with each step. At the top, a small iron hatch led to the mechanism. The dust was thick, except in one corner where it had been recently disturbed. He knelt. There, tucked beneath the base of the bell frame, was a bundle of cloth. He pulled it free and froze. It was a second habit, not folded, not clean, torn, mud-streaked, stiff with dried blood. He looked to the corner. Scratched into the stone with what must have been a nail were the words, "She knew too much." When he brought it down, the Mother Superior fainted. Later, in his study, Father Brown sat alone with the habit, the letter, the ash symbol, and the missing girl who had left behind 2 habits, 2 stories, and not a single body. That's when he opened the Bible again. He flipped through the pages quickly, stopping not at Matthew, but at Revelation. There, tucked between the pages, was a small photograph, old, black and white. 3 nuns, smiling in front of a building that no longer existed. He recognized 2 of the faces. The third was Magdalena. But the photo was dated 1904. That would make her Impossible. Father Brown's fingers trembled. Behind him, the candle flickered and went out. He whispered to no one in particular, "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told. Chapter 2. Father Brown hears a confession. The woman who entered the confessional that morning had been dead for 23 years, or so the death certificate claimed. Father Brown didn't move. He didn't even breathe. He had heard confessions that chilled him to the bone before, but nothing prepared him for the way this voice moved through the grill. Soft, cracked, neither old nor young, but drenched in something deeper than fear. It wasn't trembling. It wasn't whispering. It was remembering. She called herself M. Just that. No full name, no title, no sin named, only silence. And then the words, "I need to confess something I didn't do, because I watched someone else do it, and I stayed quiet for too long. And now, Father, I think she wants me dead." Father Brown closed his eyes. The convent was already on edge from Sister Magdalena's disappearance. And now, this. He wanted to ask her to start from the beginning, but she interrupted as though she already knew the questions. "They told me to forget her. But forgetting isn't the same as forgiving." He asked gently, "Who is she?" There was a pause, then a whisper. "The girl who folded her own habit before she died." A spike of cold ran down Father Brown's spine. No one outside the convent should have known how they found the garment. No newspapers had printed that detail. No one, not even the local constables, had been told it was folded, not discarded. "I shouldn't be here," the voice said, "but she comes every night now, in the corridor, behind the mirror, in the bell tower's chime. She wants someone to speak." He asked carefully, "Is she asking for justice?" The woman replied, "No. She's asking for memory. She wants me to remember what they did to her, before I forget myself entirely." And then, just like that, the confessional door creaked open and closed again. But when Father Brown stepped out into the chapel, no one was there. No cloak, no scent, no sign of footprints on the rain-damp stone floor. Just a single candle on the front pew, burning, though no one remembered lighting it. That day, he asked the convent's record keeper for access to the death registry. "We only keep those of our own," Sister Bernadette replied, "and only those officially recognized by the church." He nodded. "Even the unofficial ones leave shadows." He stayed in the library until the bell rang for supper. The logs were handwritten, some going back over a century. The ink faded, names trembling in and out of legibility. But then he saw it. A record from 1901. Name, Margarita. No last name. Cause of death, drowned. Burial, unlisted. There was a note in the margin, "Clothing returned to linen room. No remains found." That was all. No body, no burial site. Just clothing. He returned to the linen room. The sisters kept it organized with military precision. Folds so sharp you could cut paper on the edges. But he wasn't looking for neatness. He was looking for error. At the back of the shelf, underneath rows of white, he found a pale blue habit, worn by postulants in the old days, before final vows. It was tucked behind a loose panel, unlabeled, slightly damp. Inside its fold was a rosary made of bone. Not wood, not silver, bone. He didn't speak of it. Not yet. But that night, he didn't sleep. He walked the grounds until the moon reached its highest point. And that's when he heard it, singing. Not distant, not echoing. Close. The hymn was old. Pre-Vatican, in Latin. A funeral song. But what chilled Father Brown was not the words, it was the voice. It was the same voice from the confessional. He followed it through the cloister, past the garden, through the locked gate, into the bell tower. No one was there, just the rope, gently swaying as though someone had let go of it seconds earlier. He descended in silence. At dawn, Sister Agnes was found unconscious in the nave. When she awoke, she claimed someone had written on her arm, in ash, "Remember me." No one saw who did it, but the handwriting matched the note Father Brown had recovered the week before, the letter hidden in the library. Later that day, the local inspector arrived with news. Someone had broken into the public records archive in town. Nothing stolen, but one folder had been opened and rearranged. The file? Convent of St. Agnes. Deaths prior to 1920. Father Brown asked to see it. Inside was a torn photograph. The same photo he had found in the Bible, but this version had something different. A fourth figure, now faded, standing just behind the others, partially obscured by light, but clearly present. A woman with eyes too bright to belong in a world of silence. He compared the handwriting from the file's label with the confessional graffiti, the note in the Bible, and the margin on the death registry. It was identical. One hand, one voice, one witness, who had supposedly died in 1901. By now, he knew better than to assume the living were the only ones speaking. That evening, he returned to the confessional, locked the door from the inside, and waited. Hours passed. No one entered. But just as he rose to leave, the wooden grill whispered, not with a voice, with breathing, shallow, labored, and wet. He sat down again. His own heartbeat slowed. He didn't speak, and then barely audible. "She's not the first." He asked nothing, only waited. The voice spoke again. There were others, all in blue, all before vows. They were told to wait, to pray, to be still. And then they never spoke again. His skin prickled. "How many?" he asked. The breathing stopped. Then, one word. 6. Before he could respond, a sharp gust blew through the booth, slamming the inner shutter closed. The candle outside flickered violently. He opened the door, and the chapel was full of smoke. The altar cloth had caught fire. No one knew how, but the only thing damaged was the edge of the crucifix, where a name had been etched centuries ago, now charred beyond recognition. That night, Father Brown made a decision. He called the diocese and asked for full access to the sealed files from the convent's early years. They denied him, so he returned to the chapel and asked the one person who never denied anyone, the truth itself. He sat before the altar and whispered, "If you want to be heard, speak now. If justice matters more than silence, show me where to look." A single drop of water fell from the ceiling, onto the blue habit he'd laid beside him. He looked up. No leak, no rain, no stain, just stone. And silence. Until he saw it. The fresco above the altar, painted over centuries ago, had begun to peel. And beneath the flaking paint was another figure, a nun, in blue, mouth open in mid-scream, eyes blank, arms outstretched, as though she were falling or being buried. He stepped back. His heart pounded, and in that moment, the bell rang, 12 times, though no one was pulling the rope. And outside, someone had written again on the garden wall, in that same trembling hand, "I confess," but only he hears. When asked the next day what had happened, Father Brown said nothing, except this: "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 3. Midnight footsteps. No one heard. The only reason they discovered the body was because the candle wouldn't stop flickering. in a room with no wind, no movement, and no living soul inside. At exactly 12 minutes past midnight, Sister Lucille noticed the faint tremble of light escaping from beneath the locked door of the old infirmary, an unused wing of the convent sealed off for years. The candlelight danced, stubborn and steady, even as the corridor remained cloaked in unnatural silence. She said nothing to the others, but by morning, she would no longer be able to speak at all. When Father Brown arrived, they were already carrying Sister Lucille out of the hallway on a stretcher. She wasn't dead, but her eyes were wide and empty, as if they had looked into something that hadn't looked back, but reached instead. Her hands were cold, clenched tightly around a rosary that wasn't hers, and her mouth kept moving. Just one phrase, over and over, lips pale. "She walks when we..." Don't listen. He didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. Inside the infirmary, there was no candle, no wind, no sign of forced entry. But the stone floor held footprints, bare, damp, and unmistakably fresh. They led from the far wall to the bed, and then simply stopped. No return prints, no smudge of retreat, as if the one who walked had vanished into the air, or beneath it. He knelt by the prints and noticed something even stranger. The dew on the floor hadn't been disturbed. The prints were imprinted beneath the moisture, not above it, as though the footsteps had been made before the dew fell, except it hadn't rained inside the room. There were no windows, no cracks, nothing. Just silence, cold, and those wet, impossibly quiet steps. He asked Sister Bernadette for the key to the wing's records, but she hesitated. "No one's been in that room since the war," she said. "It's been sealed." "Sealed rooms don't grow new footprints," he replied. The key took hours to find. Rusted, disused. When he opened the archives, the dust stirred in the air like breath. Pages stuck together, some water-damaged, others too perfect. He found the record for the infirmary's last occupant, postulant 112, status unconfirmed. No name, no death recorded, no transfer, just one line in red ink. Refused silence. That same day, a second nun fainted. Sister Eloise, younger, braver. She'd heard footsteps behind her in the garden, she said, but when she turned around, no one was there. She screamed because the footsteps didn't stop. They kept walking toward her, even as her ears told her no one was moving. And when she collapsed, her veil was torn by something no one saw. Father Brown returned to the chapel alone. Midnight came. This time, he waited inside. The door creaked once, then again, but no one entered. Still, the sound of footsteps began. Soft, measured, carefully paced, but they weren't echoing. They were absorbing, as if the stone floor swallowed the sound, rather than carried it. He whispered, "Who's there?" Nothing. Then a voice, not spoken, but breathed. She didn't fall. She was pushed. The candles flared. All of them, a dozen flames roaring in an instant, then dying again, just as fast. The next morning, he searched the convent's bell tower for the 4th time. But this time, he brought something with him. A scrap of cloth from the blue habit they had found. He held it up to the old wooden beams. The scent changed. The air grew wet. Something above him dripped. It wasn't water, it was wax. And in the wax, pressed like a seal, was the faint shape of a foot, bare, small, slightly turned inward, as if someone had been standing upside down, feet pressed to the ceiling. He didn't tell anyone, but that afternoon, Sister Anne went missing. Again, no signs of struggle, no screams, only a single line written on the mirror in the laundry room. Footsteps never sleep. They found her the next day in the old sacristy, arms folded across her chest like a corpse prepared for burial. She was alive, but her mouth was sewn shut, not with thread, but with ash. Black lines traced the corners of her lips, and her eyes leaked tears of blood. Father Brown refused the police. "They won't understand," he told the Mother Superior. "They'll look for a person. And this isn't one." He returned to the infirmary. This time, he brought chalk. He traced each footprint, noted their size, spacing, depth, and noticed something devastating. They didn't belong to the same person. Some were small, some broader, some with turned toes, some perfectly straight. There wasn't one ghost. There were several, and all of them were walking in the same direction, toward the bed, as if summoned, as if returning. He pulled the bed away from the wall and found the floorboards beneath were loose. He pried them open and found a diary, wrapped in blue cloth, sealed with wax. No name, only a date, March 3rd, 1899. Inside, page after page of madness. The writer spoke of voices behind walls, of sisters who walked while sleeping, of vows made under false names, of punishments that didn't end in forgiveness, but in burial. She wrote, "We are made to be silent. But silence doesn't erase footsteps, it makes them louder. She comes now, not to be seen, but to make us hear." The last page was soaked in ink. The words blurred, but one line remained readable. "Midnight is when memory returns, and the feet that carried secrets begin walking again." That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. At midnight, the bell rang once, then stopped. He stood in the corridor, waited, and then he saw it. A ripple in the dust. Not a shadow, not a form, a pressure, as if someone were walking just ahead of him, footsteps pressing down, but never making a sound. He followed them, through the cloister, into the chapel, to the altar, where the candle, always burning, suddenly snuffed itself out. He whispered, "What do you want?" And from the dark, "To be heard." He turned. No one. But on the altar, cloth someone had written with soot. They called it silence. I called it murder. By morning, the Mother Superior had left. No note, no goodbye, only her cross, left hanging on the confessional's door. Father Brown didn't chase her. He understood. Some truths are heavier than guilt. That evening, the chapel remained dark. No mass was held. The sisters stayed in their rooms. No one walked the halls, except for the footsteps, soft, slow, continuous. And for the first time, Father Brown didn't follow them. He only listened, and whispered as they passed his door, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 4. The cloister held a secret. The scream didn't come from any living nun. It came from beneath the stones, where no voice should still be able to scream. It was just past 3 in the morning when Sister Pauline bolted upright in her cell, trembling and clutching the crucifix at her chest. She swore she heard it, a voice muffled, not in the wind or through the walls, but under them, like something buried was still trying to call for help. She ran to the cloister. The rest of the convent was sleeping, unaware, but she stood barefoot in the corridor, her eyes fixed on the stone tiles, lips murmuring the Lord's Prayer, backwards. By the time Father Brown arrived, the sun was rising, but no warmth entered the stone hallways. Pauline was gone, not missing, just wrong. She stood near the cloister wall, smiling, but her hands were muddy and bleeding. Her nails had been torn down to the flesh. When he gently asked what had happened, she turned to him, blinked once, and said in a voice not quite hers, "There's someone down there." They all heard it that day, even the skeptics, a sound that came from beneath the cloister, soft, wet, rhythmic, a knocking. Not random, not an echo. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks again. It didn't match any bell pattern, and when they put their ears to the floor, they felt it in their bones. The cloister, centuries old, had been a place of silence, of walking meditation, of sacred reflection. But now it throbbed with something else, as if its stones weren't just old, but witnesses. The knocking continued for 3 nights in a row, each time at the same hour, 3:07 a.m. On the 4th night, it stopped. But something else happened. One of the tiles near the statue of St. Cecilia shifted, just a hair, enough to crack the wax candle at its base, enough to breathe dust that hadn't stirred in hundreds of years. Father Brown touched it. The stone was cold, but not the cold of winter, the cold of metal, of iron sealed under stone. He ordered. The floor excavated. The Mother Superior protested. "Of course, that cloister is consecrated. It cannot be disturbed," but he stared at her until she stopped speaking. The silence between them was louder than any prayer. When the workers lifted the first stones, they found the lid of a hatch, old iron, rusted, sealed with mortar from another century. It bore no cross, no markings of the church, just a handprint burned into the metal, small, like a child's, but stretched, distorted, twisted in, agony. No key could open it, so they broke the lock. Beneath the hatch was a stairwell, narrow, damp, steep. The smell was of mold, decay, and perfume. A sweet scent. Lavender. The same smell that had clung to Sister Magdalena's folded habit. Father Brown descended first. He didn't speak. He didn't light his candle right away. He waited until his foot touched the stone floor below. Then he lit the flame. The walls were covered in writing, dozens of hands, scratched in with nails and stone. Latin, French, even 1 or 2 in older tongues he didn't recognize, all repeating a single phrase, "I will not forget her name." At the far end of the chamber, there was a door, a wooden one, blackened by time, but intact. On it, another message. She refused to be silent. He opened the door. Inside, he expected to find a cell, a tomb, a punishment chamber. What he found was a chapel, underground, hidden, forgotten, but not empty. In the pews were statues, dozens of them, each dressed in a nun's habit, each face unique, realistic, too realistic, and each had a number painted in white on its chest, postulants, every one of them. And at the altar stood one final statue, unnumbered, face covered in a veil, but her hands were flesh, fresh. He stepped back, blinked, but the hands didn't vanish. They were real. Someone had placed a body in the chapel, recently, and not buried it, displayed it. A girl, dressed in blue, lips sewn shut, eyes painted open, a rosary wrapped around her wrists, like shackles. At her feet, written in fresh ash, were the words, "Forgive me, sister." Father Brown did not look away. He heard footsteps above, panicked, running. One of the sisters had fainted. Another had seen a face in her mirror that wasn't hers. The cloister above was cracking, not structurally, spiritually. Every lie buried there was clawing its way back up. The next morning, Sister Pauline vanished again. This time, they found her kneeling before the hidden chapel, whispering. She said, "They all lied. Every one of them, even the priests. even the dead. When asked who she meant, she only laughed, not like a nun, like a child playing hide-and-seek in a graveyard. That evening, Father Brown returned to the underground chapel. He counted the statues, 47, but only 38 names were recorded in the convent's registry of postulants from the last 100 years. 9 were never written down. 9 girls entered the walls. None were remembered. He returned to the crypt. He searched the base of each statue. Behind one, a gap. Inside it, a box. Inside the box, a set of letters, unsigned, all written in the same hand. They spoke of rituals, of silent vows not spoken but sealed, of a tradition long removed from Scripture, of blood oaths made in the name of obedience, and of one girl who broke the chain, Magdalena, not the first, just the last to try, at least until now. The final letter ended with a chilling line. She walks now, because silence failed, because secrets are loudest beneath the stones. We kneel on Father Brown left the chapel. He didn't tell the police. He didn't tell the bishop. He only placed one candle on the hatch before resealing it. And when the wind blew it out a moment later, he whispered, "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told. Chapter 5. A rosary found with blood. The rosary was still warm when they picked it up, but the blood on its beads had long since dried into something darker than death. Father Brown didn't flinch when he saw it. He didn't speak, didn't blink, didn't even reach for his handkerchief as the young groundskeeper held out the tangle of wooden beads strung together with iron wire, each one sticky with something that wasn't wax or wine. It had been found beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the forest, convent garden, where nothing had grown for years except rumors and regret. But this was not superstition. This was a message. One crucifix, snapped clean at the neck. 5 decades of Hail Marys clotted with the kind of silence that always meant someone had bled for keeping it. The groundskeeper hadn't been digging for secrets. He was clearing weeds. But he'd struck something that made a hollow thud, then another. And then the earth opened with a sigh, as if it had been holding its breath for a century. He reached into the pit and pulled out what looked like a prayer. But prayers aren't supposed to leave stains. By the time Father Brown arrived, the garden had been cordoned off. The nuns stood at a distance, whispering not to each other, but to themselves. No one asked who the rosary belonged to. Everyone knew, but no one could say it. Not out loud, not in daylight. Magdalena again. The name felt like an infection spreading through the convent. A word everyone feared would summon something far worse than scandal. He held the rosary to the light. The crucifix wasn't made of wood. It was carved bone. The wire threading it together wasn't standard church silver. It was barbed. Someone had fashioned this as both devotion and punishment, as if prayer had to hurt to count. He took it inside, laid it on the altar, and prayed for an answer he already feared he knew. That night, the bells rang at the wrong hour. Not midnight, not matins, but 3:33 a.m. 3 rings, then silence, then 3 more. No one confessed to pulling the rope, but someone had, or something had. The next morning, the floor of the chapel was marked. Not vandalized, not burned, just damp. A pattern, like something had been dragged across it. When they followed the trail, it stopped directly beneath the altar. And there, tucked beneath the cloth, was a second rosary. Identical, except this one was clean. The clean one had a name etched into the crucifix, M.C., and a date, 1896. The bloody one bore Nothing. No initials, no clue, except the unmistakable shape of a tooth lodged inside the center bead. Not a human tooth. A wolf's. Father Brown didn't speak for hours after that. He sat alone in the library and pulled every file, every forgotten register, every hand-penned record dating back to the last renovation of the convent. And he found it, buried in the notes from the stonemason who had repaired the garden wall in 1902. A small footnote, almost casual. Found remains while setting new stones. Animal tooth lodged in bead string. Reported to bishop. Told to reseal ground. No mention of a body. No mention of a name. Just reseal the ground. That evening, Father Brown went to the bishop's residence. The bishop wasn't in, or rather, he was inside, but wouldn't open the door. A note was handed to Father Brown instead. 3 words, handwritten. Let the dead lie. He burned the note that night. Not out of anger, out of necessity. Some warnings aren't meant to be archived. Later, in the chapel, he sat before the altar where both rosaries now lay, one clean, one soaked in secrets, and he asked the empty pews, "Who are you protecting?" The candle flickered, the doors groaned, and behind him, a whisper. Not who. What he turned. No one. Only the stained glass, catching moonlight in such a way that the painted Christ appeared to be weeping blood. The next day, the garden tree collapsed. Its roots had grown through stone, bone, and buried sins. The collapse revealed a box, iron, sealed. Inside it, bones, small, fragile, human, wrapped in a 3rd rosary. But this one wasn't barbed. It was gold, pure, untarnished, as if time hadn't touched it. Inside the box, a scrap of fabric, embroidered with initials. Sister Magdalene had never been officially canonized, but someone had treated her as something sacred, and someone else had treated her like a warning. The convent broke into whispers, then arguments, then silence, because Father Brown didn't show up to morning prayers. They found him the next evening in the bell tower, unconscious. In his hand, a page torn from a very old book. The ink had faded. The script was in Latin, but the phrase translated loosely to, "They who hold the blooded rosary are cursed to remember what others died to forget." When he woke, he didn't speak. Not for hours. And then only to say, "There's a 4th one." They didn't believe him until they found it in the confessional, wrapped around the neck of the wooden Christ. This one was burned black. Every bead cracked. The crucifix melted into the shape of a serpent. The confessional was sealed that night, and Father Brown went back to the garden alone. He knelt, prayed, whispered, not to God, to the earth, to the bones, to the girl who had never finished her prayer. And when he rose, he said one sentence to the dark, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 6. The Confession That Disappeared Forever. The last person to enter the confessional that night was never seen again. Yet the door never opened, the candle never went out, and no one heard them leave. It was a bitter evening, wind howling outside the stone walls of St. Agnes, rain clawing at the stained glass windows like fingernails from a past that refused to stay buried. Evening Mass had just ended. The sisters dispersed in hushed silence. The chapel flickered with the last of the altar candles, and Father Brown remained seated in the last pew, waiting, not for a soul, for something heavier, the kind of weight that settles when truth begins to rot. At 9:47 p.m., precisely, the wooden door of the confessional creaked open on the left side. Someone stepped in, not hurriedly, not frightened, just still, as though they'd already accepted what they had to say might destroy them. Father Brown entered the right side moments later. He didn't recognize the voice that followed, low, soft, like it had been soaked in silence for years. "She told me her death would be quiet," the voice said. But it wasn't. I heard it, and I still hear it. Father Brown listened. He didn't interrupt. This was no ordinary confession. The voice continued. "There are 4 of us who knew, but we never spoke, because if we did, the walls would tell the rest, and the walls remember more than we ever could." Then came the detail that chilled him. She wasn't buried. She was hidden, under the organ. The voice trembled for the first time. "I lit the candle that night. I swore I wouldn't speak, but it burns me every time I pray. And now she walks in the cloister. She doesn't say my name, but I know she will." Father Brown leaned forward, heart pounding. "Who are you?" he asked quietly, but the voice didn't respond, only breathing. Then silence. He waited. 10 minutes, 20. Then opened the screen. The other side was empty. He stepped out into the chapel. The confessional door was still shut, but the pews were untouched. No footsteps marked the floor. He turned back and found something resting where the voice had been. A torn piece of parchment. Not paper, not modern, old vellum, with ink almost bled through by time. And a single line in Latin, "Ego audivi et taqui." I heard, and I was silent. The next day, he returned to the confessional to examine the paneling. There was nothing there, no hidden compartment, no mechanism, no trick, but the candle inside had burned, down 2 inches more than it should have, as if someone had sat there much longer than the 10 minutes he'd counted. That afternoon, he went to the organ. It hadn't been played in years. Dust coated the keys, but something had scraped the pedals recently. He lifted the bench and pried at the floor beneath. Hollow, he called for help. They pulled up the boards. Beneath was a cavity, just deep enough for a person. No body, but what remained was worse. A folded habit, a lock of hair, and a single shoe, child-sized, blackened with mold. On the inner sole, in faint handwriting, the initials M.R. He took them to the archives. There was no one listed with those initials in the last 80 years. When he asked the archivist about any undocumented postulants, she froze. "There were rumors," she said. "A girl who was sent here during the war, said to have been a refugee, but she never took her vows. They said she ran away." "Who said?" asked Father Brown. She didn't answer. That night, he went back to the confessional, lit the candle, waited. No one came. But at midnight, the candle extinguished on its own, and a whisper brushed his ear from the other side. "You were supposed to remember." The next morning, the confessional door was found open. Inside, ashes, fine, black, perfectly shaped into a circle. A burned prayer card lay in the center, Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of silence. He questioned every sister in the convent. None of them had spoken to him in the confessional. None had entered it at all that night. But Sister Amalia, the oldest nun, trembled when he showed her the parchment. She whispered, "That's her handwriting." "Whose?" "The one we were told never existed." He pressed. She refused, until she broke. They made her take confession every night, for weeks, but she never sinned. That's what made them nervous. What happened to her? Amalia looked up, and for the first time, Father Brown saw someone who had truly lost God. She confessed something they didn't want forgiven. He returned to the chapel that evening, drawn by instinct or guilt, and there, hanging on the cross above the altar, was the rosary, not the blood-stained one, not the gold one. This one was made of teeth, each bead a tooth, from a child. He climbed up to remove it, and underneath the crucifix was a carved message: "Confession is not escape." That night, the rain didn't fall. It bled. Red water pooled in the cloister garden, and the sisters refused to enter the chapel. Every candle flickered without wind. Every door opened without hands. Father Brown sat in the confessional once more, alone, waiting, and just before the candle died again, a voice returned. But this time, it wasn't trembling. It was angry. "You erased me. Now I'll erase you." Then silence. The door remained locked. He opened the screen. Nothing. Only a cracked crucifix hanging upside down. By morning, the entire chapel was covered in ash. All records of MR were gone from the archive. Every confession written in the logs for the past century, burned. Gone. Even Father Brown's notes. Erased. As if someone, or something, had swallowed every word. The Mother Superior denied everything. But Father Brown looked at her and simply said, "I know who did it. But the truth will never be told." Chapter 7. One candle still burned. Alone. The morning they found the chapel ransacked, and every candle snuffed out by hands no one saw, there was one flame still burning, and it sat beneath a name no one remembered carving. Father Brown was the first to enter. The air was thick, not with incense or the echo of prayer, but with something heavier, like a room that had been sealed around a scream. The pews had been overturned, hymn books torn, the crucifix removed from the altar and laid gently, face down, on the floor. But at the far end of the room, behind the old confessional, where the stone curved into a shadowed alcove, long sealed off from worship, one tiny candle stood upright on a narrow iron plate, still lit, still alive, flickering not with warmth, but with warning. Beneath it, scratched into the wood with something sharper than a knife, was a name no one in the convent recognized. Leontia. Father Brown had never seen that name in any registry, not among the postulants, not in the burial records, not even in the archives hidden behind the bishop's seal. But it was written clearly, deeply, as if carved from inside the wood, not upon it. He moved to extinguish the flame, but paused. The wick wasn't wax. It was thread, blackened linen, like a torn strip from a habit. Sister Clara entered seconds later and collapsed. She pointed to the candle and muttered only one thing before fainting. "I saw her light it." That would have been impossible, because Sister Clara had been in isolation for 4 days, confined, fevered. She wasn't allowed in the chapel, and even if she had been, there was no her to see. No one had gone near that alcove in years. It had been closed after the last confession vanished. Later that day, the old convent gardener, a mute man named Elias, who hadn't spoken a word since childhood, drew something in the dirt outside the chapel steps. A shape. A circle with a flame at its center, and beside it he placed a stone rosary made entirely of salt. When Father Brown picked it up, the beads began to melt, not in his hands, but before they touched his skin. Something was wrong. He returned to the chapel, but the candle had burned out by then. The name remained deeper now, as if someone had recarved it overnight. Leontia. He traced it with his finger and found the wood warm. That night, the dreams began again. Not his. The sisters. Each of them, different dreams, but all ending the same way, with a woman in a blue habit standing beside a single candle, whispering their names one by one, and saying, "You forgot me." Now remember the light. Father Brown found himself walking the cloister corridors without realizing why, drawn to corners of the building, long sealed, rooms half-bricked behind forgotten renovations. The chapel bell rang twice at 3:12 a.m., a time it had never been rung before. He lit a candle of his own and placed it where the first had been. He sat in silence, staring at the wall, waiting. A draught moved through the chapel, but the flame didn't waver. Instead, the shadows bent, not away from the light, toward it, as if drawn or summoned. He looked back at the door. It was shut. No one else inside, yet someone was breathing behind him. He turned. No one. He turned again, and the candle was no longer a flame. It was a face, mouth open, eyes glowing, screaming, but no sound. And then it vanished. The candle remained, but now the wax was red. The next morning, Sister Imelda brought Father Brown a journal, old, molded, frayed at the edges. She said it had appeared on her bed when she returned from morning prayer. It wasn't hers. Inside, every page bore the same writing. "I am the flame. I burn because they buried me cold." The final page had a sketch, a chapel, but not the current one, a different layout, a second altar, a trapdoor beneath the choir loft. Father Brown checked the floor plans from 1830. They matched the drawing. There had been a second altar, removed, covered. No reason given in the records. He returned to the choir loft and tapped at the stones beneath the floorboards. Hollow. He pried one up, then another, and another. Beneath, a narrow space, just wide enough for a body, empty, except for a burned candle, long melted into the stone, and a single fingernail, carved into the rock beside it. "Still I burn." He closed the stone, walked away. That evening, another candle lit itself, in the main chapel, alone. No one near it. But this time, the flame was blue, and it hovered, not on the wick above it, shaped like a hand, and on the wall beside it, in soot. "Blow me out, and she returns." Father Brown didn't move. He watched the flame flicker higher, and he whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 8. Father Brown finds her crucifix. The crucifix had no chain, no blood, no dust, and yet it was buried in a grave that no one had ever opened. It was during the third exhumation that they found it, lodged between stone and bone, in a crypt that hadn't held a body for over 90 years. Officially, at least. The sisters stood silent at the threshold of the underground vault, lips pale, prayers dry on their tongues, unable to explain why the slab bore no name, no date, no blessing, just the faint imprint of a handprint, scorched into the lid. The grave should have been empty, and in every record it was. But when the tomb was opened, what they found wasn't a corpse. It was a single crucifix, resting in the center of the stone bed, warm to the touch, and humming, softly. Not like metal echoing sound, but like a heartbeat. Father Brown reached for it slowly. The others stepped back. No one told them to. They just knew. He knelt, not out of reverence, but caution. He had seen relics, twisted before. Seen objects that held memory longer than the living. But this was different. The crucifix was small, delicate, but carved with the intricacy of a master. Wood fused with bone, a faint floral pattern along the edges that seemed more etched than engraved. At the center of the cross, where Christ's body should have been, was nothing. Just a hollow silhouette, as if someone had removed the figure and not recently. There was no rust, no scrape, no scar from the removal. It had never been there. The cross had been made to bear nothing or no one. The nuns didn't recognize it, not publicly, but one, Sister Clement, collapsed upon seeing it. She whispered one word before she lost consciousness: Magdalena. But the dead girl's possessions had all been accounted for, or so they had claimed. Her habit, her rosary, her letters. And yet here was a crucifix no one had spoken of, hidden in a tomb no one had dared open. Father Brown took it to his chambers. That night, he barely slept. The crucifix didn't glow, it didn't move. But every time he closed his eyes, he heard a voice, not shouting, not whispering, but reciting, Credo quia absurdum. I believe because it is absurd. The next morning, the chapel smelled of smoke, but nothing had burned, not visibly. Still, Father Brown noticed the candle stands near the altar were warped, melted, not from flame, but from heat too old to see. On the wall behind them, a shape had appeared in the stone, a cross, matching the crucifix, and beneath it, 3 lines had been scratched in soot. You hid the body, you buried the voice, but the cross remembers. He returned to the tomb, searching for clues. There was no grave marker, but beneath the empty space, deeper than the first excavation, he found another layer of stone, one with a seam. It was a false floor. He pried it up. Beneath it, cloth, torn blue linen, drenched in the scent of lavender and iron, and beside it, 3 finger bones, small, human, female. There had been a body, long ago, removed, but not without trace. That night, Sister Clement began to scream in her sleep. She cried out for forgiveness, for light, for silence. She gave me the crucifix, she sobbed, before they took her away. But when pressed, she refused to say who they were. Father Brown asked her alone. She would not speak, but she drew something on his desk before she left his office. A symbol, a circle with thorns. He'd seen it before, etched into the spine of a forbidden volume in the convent's sealed library. He broke the lock on the door. Inside, thick air and dust choked the lantern light. But there, between mold-eaten books and forgotten scrolls, he found it. De Silentium, the Book of Silence. Inside, the symbol, and beside it, a passage. In times of heresy and insurrection, those who bear the cross of absence are not to be burned. They are to be erased, and beneath it, a list of names, all crossed out, all except one, Leontia Magdalena, first name erased in every convent record, but here, intact. Beside it, one more symbol, a crucifix, empty. He brought the book and the crucifix to the chapel that night. No sisters present, only the storm outside. He placed the crucifix on the altar, waited, and then the flame lit itself. The candle nearest the cross bloomed with light, and the chapel doors slammed shut. He heard footsteps, bare, slow, dragging. They circled the altar, then stopped, and the flame bent sideways, pointing toward the confessional. He entered. It inside was cold. Then, not cold, just empty. He looked down. The crucifix had followed him. No one had touched it. It now lay on the floor beside his foot. He picked it up, and on its back, new carving. Words that hadn't been there before. You believe in her now. The next morning, the crucifix was gone. The confessional was locked from the inside, but no one was there, only the smell of lavender and the faint sound of humming from behind the altar wall. When they knocked, the sound stopped, and behind the brick, a hollow thud echoed back, like something had moved. Father Brown didn't order the wall torn down. He didn't speak of the crucifix again. But when asked what he found in the grave, he simply said, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 9. She vanished after saying Amen. The last thing Sister Miriam ever did was close her eyes, bow her head, whisper Amen, and never open them again. There were no footsteps, no scream, no rustle of cloth or flicker of shadow, just silence, absolute and final. One moment she was kneeling beside the others during morning prayer, her voice steady and sure. The next, an empty space where her body had been, her folded veil still resting on the pew, still warm, as if she had simply slipped out of it, like mist through stone. The candle at her side still burned, untouched. Her prayer book lay open to the same psalm she had read every day since her vows. But Sister Miriam, the most devoted among them, was gone. They searched the chapel, then the garden, the halls, even the sealed crypts below. No trace, no scent, no sound. Father Brown stood in the doorway of the chapel as the rest of the sisters scattered, their panic growing with every unanswered question. He walked slowly to where she'd last knelt and touched the pew. Her rosary was gone, not dropped, not misplaced, removed. There was no gap in the service, no time for her to leave. None of the other nuns saw her rise, and yet the space she left behind was cold. Not the cold of absence, but of interruption, of something unnatural, like a breath taken in and never released. When they brought in the constable, he found nothing, no signs of escape, no broken locks, and no motive. Sister Miriam had no enemies, no secrets, but Father Brown didn't believe in clean souls. Not anymore, not in this place, especially not after the crucifix had reappeared in his chamber 2 nights earlier, resting on his pillow, untouched, though the door had been locked and the windows sealed. That crucifix now sat beside the chapel altar, where Miriam had last whispered her final word, Amen. It had changed again. A small crack ran through the center of the wood, like a wound trying not to bleed. The hollow silhouette where the figure of Christ should have been had deepened, the edges burned, as if fire had tried to take it but couldn't hold on. He examined the prayer book she'd left. It had a note inside, a torn piece of parchment with just 2 lines written in red ink. She said his name 3 times. The last time, he answered. He asked the other sisters what that could mean. None would speak. But later that evening, Sister Juliet quietly placed a folded cloth in his hand, an old, yellowed handkerchief with a name embroidered in one corner, Leontia. The name again. The name that kept surfacing. The name that wasn't supposed to exist. Did Miriam ever speak of her? He asked. Sister Juliet nodded. They used to pray together. Late, in the dark. Not aloud. How do you know? Because they both stopped smiling the same week. Father Brown lit a candle beside the altar and waited. That night, he returned to the pew where Miriam had vanished. He knelt, whispered the same psalm, closed his eyes, and said, Amen. Nothing happened until he opened them. The chapel was dark. The candles were still lit, but the light no longer reached the walls, as if the space had changed shape or time. He turned. The pews were empty, except for one. A single figure knelt, back turned, head bowed. He rose, approached slowly. The air around the figure pulsed, cold and too still. He reached out and touched her shoulder, but his hand passed through fabric that wasn't fabric, and suddenly the candles blew out. When the light returned, He was alone again, and the floor where she had knelt was soaked, not with water, but with wax, and beneath the wax a word carved deep into the stone: taken. The next day, Sister Juliet went missing too, and this time they found something: a scrap of linen, wrapped around a single bead from Miriam's rosary, blackened, cracked, still warm. When Father Brown placed it beside the crucifix, the wood groaned, the chapel doors refused to open, and above the altar the wall began to bleed, not red, but black, slow, silent, like ink from a forgotten story. He returned to the sealed library, looking for any mention of the word taken in older texts. What he found instead was a letter, folded and hidden behind a false panel in the ledger of convent assets. It was unsigned, but it was addressed to the next who dares to kneel. It read, "She vanished, not because she was unworthy, but because she believed fully. They who pray in full truth are seen, and those who are seen cannot remain." Father Brown lowered the letter. The crucifix in his coat pocket burned. That night, a third candle lit itself in the chapel. Beside it, a rosary made of teeth, small, human, childlike. No one came to prayer the next morning, not because they forgot, but because they remembered. They remembered the sound of the Amen, and how it was the last thing they ever heard from her. That day, Father Brown didn't speak, but he carved a word into the pew himself, a word to remind the others, believe, and beneath it, in smaller letters, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 10. The last prayer was staged. The last prayer was never meant to reach heaven. It was written by someone who already knew it would end in blood. They found the body lying perfectly still beneath the altar, arms folded, face serene, as if caught mid-sermon. A single candle still burned beside her, untouched by wind or wax. Her lips were parted, frozen on the final syllable of Amen. But there was no warmth left in her breath, no trauma, no sign of violence, no struggle, just the kind of stillness that felt rehearsed, choreographed, every fold in her veil aligned like a stage direction, every finger interlaced like a script told her where to put them. She didn't die in prayer, she was placed in it, and whoever arranged her body knew that prayer could be faked, so long as no one looked too closely. But Father Brown did. He noticed it first in the fingertips, clean, but too clean. The kind of clean that only comes when something is wiped, when evidence is deliberately erased. Her rosary was missing, and her Bible had been returned to the wrong page, opened to a passage about betrayal, not forgiveness. The ink on the page had smudges. Someone had closed the book with damp fingers. But it wasn't the deceased. Later that day, Sister Helena admitted she had seen the woman earlier, alive, in the garden, praying, out loud. That had struck her as strange. Sister Constance never prayed out loud. Her prayers were always silent, whispered within the tight curve of her mind. Helena said she smiled too much that morning, like she knew something she shouldn't, or had given something up, something heavy. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel. The body had been removed, but something else was left behind. On the pew where Sister Constance had last knelt, a folded slip of paper had been placed beneath the cushion. Old parchment, thin, fragile. The writing on it was unmistakable, sharp, precise, too perfect for someone overcome by devotion. It wasn't a prayer, it was a script. Each line detailed exactly what Constance was meant to do. How to position her hands, when to close her eyes, what line of the psalm to end on. It ended with one chilling instruction. Say Amen and stop breathing. We'll take care of the rest. It was signed with a symbol, not a name, the same symbol Father Brown had found weeks ago, carved behind the altar, burned into the wood of the confessional, etched into the melted crucifix, a circle of thorns with one petal missing, a mark of silence and secrets. He asked the other nuns who might have written it. They said no one. But Sister Miriam, before she vanished, had once mentioned a pact made long before her arrival, a ritual rehearsed but never questioned, a tradition buried beneath doctrine. She said there were prayers never spoken aloud for fear they might summon the ones who wrote them. Father Brown now knew one had been summoned, and she hadn't died. She'd been sacrificed, willingly or convinced to. He examined the altar itself. Behind the stone panel, loose mortar revealed a cavity. Inside, a box, iron, heavy. Inside the box, papers. All of them scripts. Not prayers, scripts. Dozens of them, each labeled with a name, each name crossed out in red, except one. Sister Magdalena. Her page was missing. He returned to his chamber, heart heavy, and found the candle beside his bed had burned itself into a spiral. Wax circled inward toward the wick, like it had tried to strangle itself. On the wall above his desk, a line had been written in soot. There is no prayer without audience. He didn't sleep. At dawn, the bell rang once, only once. But the bell rope had been cut the night before. He walked the halls, unsure whether he was being watched or expected. In the library, he found a new entry in the convent's record book, written in a hand too familiar to ignore. It claimed Sister Constance had been buried. She hadn't. Her body was still in the chapel, still posed, still waiting. He returned. The doors were already open, but the candles were all out, every single one, except the candle on her chest, still burning, still untouched, and now in her hands someone had placed a rosary, not hers, the blackened one, the one made of bone and ash. He stepped back. The walls pulsed, not visibly, but with breath, with presence. He whispered, "Why?" And behind him, a voice answered, low, dry, female. Because she believed the audience was him. But it was always us, he turned. No one. The candle snuffed itself. Out. The rosary remained. But it had unraveled. Each bead now bore a letter. When arranged, they spelled a single word. Witness. That night, Father Brown locked himself in the chapel and waited. But the prayer never came again, because that one had been the last, and it wasn't offered to God. It was offered to something beneath the chapel, something old, something rehearsed, and something still waiting for its curtain call. He whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 11. Someone watched the nunnery silence. The watcher didn't blink, didn't move, didn't breathe, and yet every sister in the convent claimed they had felt his gaze just before the moment something terrible went missing. It started on the first Sunday after the third funeral. The bells rang on their own again, off rhythm, off hour, and only 3 times. The number 3 had become a pattern. 3 vanished, 3 prayers rewritten, 3 names erased from the convent ledger overnight. But that Sunday, something else changed. The chapel was quiet, too quiet, not with reverence, but with dread. The kind of silence that tightens around the ribs and whispers that someone is listening from the inside. During the morning psalms, Sister Imelda froze mid-hymn. Her voice failed. Her eyes locked on the arched window above the altar. She didn't scream. She simply walked away. When Father Brown found her in the hallway, she was pressing her hand against the stone wall. She said only one thing before she fainted: "He doesn't look away." They tried to blame the stress, the grief, the string of disappearances, but even the younger novices had started whispering about it, about the feeling of being watched, of seeing a shadow move just beyond the edge of a mirror, of hearing the sound of someone walking inside the walls. No single person had seen him fully, just glimpses, a reflection in holy water, a flicker in a locked corridor, and one candle that flickered every time the word truth was spoken aloud in prayer. That same night, someone drew something in the dust of the bell tower, an eye, perfectly circular, with a single thorn piercing the iris. Below it, the phrase, "The silence was heard." Father Brown climbed the bell tower himself, not because he wanted answers, but because it was the only place where nothing had yet gone missing. Until now. One of the bells was gone. Not removed, not broken, just gone. The chain still dangled, the bolt still intact, but the bell itself, several £100 of cast iron, had vanished. No noise, no sign of damage, just absence. And then came the knock. 3 soft raps on the chapel door during midnight prayers. No one was supposed to be outside. They opened it, no one. But at the threshold was a small piece of glass, shaped like a lens, fogged by breath that hadn't yet faded. He held it up to the candlelight, and the light bent. It curved and scattered, revealing not just the flame, but a reflection inside it. A face, watching, not his, not anyone he recognized, but it was smiling. That was the first time Father Brown confessed fear. He spoke of it to no one. But in his journal, now locked inside the iron box beneath the sacristy, he wrote, "There is someone here who has never stepped foot inside the convent, but he has never left either. He doesn't follow the sisters. He watches the silence between them." Later that week, Sister Agnes disappeared. Her veil was found in the chapel pew, not folded, not dropped, but nailed, pinned with 3 iron thorns. Her prayer book was still open, but the words had changed. Psalm 27 now read, "He shall not hide me in his tabernacle, for the watcher does not sleep." No one had touched the pages. No ink was smeared. The paper hadn't been replaced, only rewritten. Father Brown ordered every window in the convent sealed. He had the old stonemasons return and inspect the walls, but they reported nothing, except for one discovery, a hollow cavity behind the oldest statue in the cloister courtyard. Inside it, an old monocle, cracked, with a cross scratched into the lens, and beneath it, a hand-carved figure of a kneeling nun, headless. They said it had been sealed in concrete for decades, but the wax from last week's chapel candles was still fresh on the figure's base. Father Brown began to suspect it wasn't the sisters being hunted. It was the prayers. Every time someone offered a plea aloud, something shifted. The last 7 prayers recorded in the confessional had all gone missing. Literally. The entries in the journal were torn out. The backings had been scorched. Even the soot on the wall behind the altar had been scraped clean. Only where those prayers had been uttered. It was as if someone was listening, not for the sins, but for the words themselves, for the act of faith, and harvesting them. He returned to the chapel, alone at midnight. Kneeling, he began to recite the Our Father. But when he reached, "Deliver us from evil," the candle beside him blew out, not from wind, from breath. He looked up. No one there, only the reflection of himself in the brass candlestick. Except in the reflection, He wasn't alone. There was someone behind him, a shape, no face, just the glint of a single lens. He spun around. Nothing, and yet not nothing. The crucifix behind the altar had been turned upside down. Its base had been removed, and in its place a scroll of parchment. Unfurling it, Father Brown saw just 3 words, written in a hand, identical to his own. You looked back. He locked the chapel for the first time in over a century. But the next morning, the doors were open, every candle burned down, and every mirror cracked, right through the center, as if something had exited through the glass, or entered. Sister Maria tried to speak that afternoon, but found her voice gone. Not from illness, from fear. She kept pointing to the upper corner of the chapel wall, to the place where the stone angels looked down. One of them now had no eyes. They had been scraped clean, but only on the inside of the statue, not the outside, like someone had climbed into the angel and looked out. Father Brown no longer prayed aloud. He no longer wrote down his sermons. He simply sat and waited for the watcher to stop watching. But the silence never ended, only deepened, like a breath being held beneath the surface of water that no longer ripples, until, at last, he whispered into the dark, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 12. The Vow She Never Broke. They buried her 3 times, once in the ground, once in the record books, and once in silence. But the vow she never broke is what finally brought the convent to its knees. The nuns never spoke her name anymore, not since the night the chapel bells rang 12 times at midnight without a single hand on the rope. She had taken her vows in a storm, in candlelight, when only 2 witnesses remained from the old order. She was young, unnaturally quiet, and completely devoted. Her vow was different. Not merely obedience, chastity, or poverty, but silence. Not just the absence of speech, but the refusal of memory. She vowed never to speak of what had happened before she arrived, never to name what she had seen, and never to explain why she carried a rosary made from the bones of sparrows instead of wood. They accepted her because she prayed harder than the rest. She knelt longer. She bled beneath the weight of discipline no one asked of her. And she never once asked for mercy, only that no one ever speak her name aloud. And they didn't, until it cracked out of Sister Agnes's mouth in a fever dream 1 month before her death. Leontia. The name opened everything. The silence of the convent turned sharp. The air grew heavier. The rosaries rusted. One by one, prayers vanished from the books, then voices from the sisters, then the sisters themselves. Father Brown had come to the convent expecting answers. He left with a single clue, a vow that had never been broken. But no one could tell him what the vow actually was, only that it had been witnessed, sealed, and hidden beneath the altar inside a glass jar filled with ash. The problem was that jar had never been found, not by the police, not by the church, not even by the bishop who had overseen the original ceremony. But he had seen something else. He had seen the candle that never went out. It burned behind the altar, on a ledge no one could reach without a ladder. No one had placed it there, and yet it burned, always, with no wick, no wax, just light, blue and low like breath. The first time he saw it, Father Brown felt it, a pulse, not in his chest, but beneath his feet. The chapel itself was breathing. That was when he knew. Her vow was still alive, and something was keeping it. He found a torn page in the oldest registry of the convent, hidden behind the lining of a baptismal record. It was stained with oil and dotted with blood, but the ink was still legible. It read, "In exchange for her silence, the convent was spared. In exchange for her memory, we were allowed to remain." Below that, in a second, trembling hand, "But vows do not dissolve. They hunger." He returned to the altar and lit 3 candles, the number of her name, of her vow, and of the graves no one dared revisit. At exactly midnight, the glass in the chapel windows cracked, not shattered, not broken, but cracked, as if something inside the room wanted out, but couldn't leave until its witness was named. That's when the floor opened, not visibly, but with a sound, a moan from beneath the stone, and from a small gap near the base of the altar, ash poured out. It wasn't carried by wind, it crawled. Father Brown knelt and brushed it back. Beneath it, a lockbox, wooden, blackened, bound in rusted silver bands. He opened it. Inside, a single piece of parchment, blank, until the candlelight touched it. Then the words emerged in smoke. "I kept it. I never told. I never broke. So why did you?" And beneath that, in smaller letters, "They asked me to vanish. I did. But the vow remains. It always will." The next day, the convent awoke to silence. Every single book in the library had been emptied. The pages were gone. Only the bindings remained. But on the wall, scratched in soot above the reading table, she said nothing. But now, someone else, my sister Juliet, was found outside, kneeling in the garden, mouth sewn shut with thorns, eyes closed, but alive. On her chest, the sparrowbone rosary, and on her wrist, carved in her own skin, "She chose me." Father Brown broke into the archive that night. He searched every ledger, every parchment, every shadow. He found one final entry, a confession from the bishop himself. She was not from here, not from anywhere we knew. She came in the storm, with light in her mouth and blood in her pockets. And when we tried to silence her, she didn't fight. She made a vow instead, that she would remember for all of us, that she would carry the silence so the rest could live in noise. We believed her, and now we are cursed by what we asked her to bear. Father Brown placed the letter beside the crucifix on the altar, and at that moment, the candle behind the altar flared, just once, and then went out, for the first time in 37 years. In the dark that followed, he felt her, standing behind him, not angry, not sad, just present, and watching. He turned. Nothing. But the crucifix was gone, and in its place, the glass jar they had never found, filled not with ash, but with breath, still moving, still trapped, still waiting. He whispered, "You never broke it, did you?" And the jar cracked, just once, enough to let out a sound, not a scream, not a curse, a name, his. That night, the convent doors shut on their own. The sisters stopped speaking, and prayer became a memory. Father Brown was the last to leave. But before he did, he etched something into the chapel wall, a sentence he would never explain, only feel. "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told."